This is Austin Liddy Limits, where authors talk to authors about books and the craft of storytelling. Sponsored by Blue Ink Review, because typing the end is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com. Allegra Hyde was born and raised in rural New Hampshire. She attended Williams College before getting her MFA at Arizona State. Her debut story collection, Of This New World, won an award for short fiction. Her novel, Eleutheria, won an award as the New Yorker Best Book of the Year. Now she's out with a new collection of stories, The Last Catastrophe, about how humanity grapples in a world transformed by climate change.
Welcome to the show, Allegra Hyde. Of
Thanks so much for having me on.
course, you're welcome. So, and I love the way this looks on my iPad here because it looks like it's glowing. But your book, your latest book, The Last Catastrophe, which will be out pretty soon, it's an excellent book of short stories and has a few pretty frightening scenarios for humanity. One is that the world is going to be eventually too hot to live in, and another is that humanity is exploring other planets for a new place to live, or the fact that technological addiction is destroying our society. If there's one theme to you personally, like one kind of thread through all of these, what do you think that is for you?
When I think about the kind of governing idea that undergirds all these stories, I think about something called global weirding, which is another way to think about global warming or climate change. And it's basically a way of thinking about kind of thinking about global warming as something that's more than just temperatures rising. It's changes in our climate that are altering migration patterns and seasons and the way the ocean works, and ultimately all those things affect us as human beings, and it's making our world and our lives weirder. And I extrapolate that further to think about how are our political systems weirding, our social structures weirding, our technological systems weirding. And that's kind of the way I'm stitching together these stories with their different catastrophic scenarios.
Right. Yeah, I've read an article recently that was describing which town in the US would be the most ideal to live in once our just everything just gets too hot. And what do you think about that kind of idea that people are starting to think about that now?
Yeah, I think it is it's on more and more people's minds for sure. And we're already starting to see people moving to areas of the country that are perceived as safer, or just aren't experiencing climate crises actively. People are leaving California, for instance, and there are maps online where you can kind of see the different places where Californians are heading. And ultimately, I don't think there's any place that is 100% safe from climate change. It's going to reach us all and affect us all if it hasn't already. But there are areas of the United States and elsewhere that may be more protected, maybe.
Right. I mean, we're already experiencing that here in Texas where I live. I mean, particularly since, hurricanes are coming more and more. They're stronger. They're displacing people like in New Orleans that are moving to Texas, and in some cases permanently staying. So it's something that's been happening for a while.
Yeah, I was kind of interested to see that Austin is expanding a lot, and that's one of the kind of places that Californians are heading. And I think it's more inland, unlike Houston. And maybe it's in some ways more protected from wildfires, but of course Austin has its own challenges around probably water and heat.
Right. Right. Yeah, definitely water's one, because our source, Lake Travis, is, in times of drought, it gets really low. And so with more population coming, it makes it harder. And plus we have, I don't know if a lot of people know this or think about it often, but we have a lot of tornadoes here in Texas, particularly in Austin, and they seem to be getting stronger and stronger. And, the quantity of them is more. So one of the other things that really surprised me about your book, and it's not really listed anywhere this way, is that a lot of the stories are pretty funny. The scenarios are pretty funny. Not funny like har har, but just the setup of the scenario. For instance, the displaced husbands, that story is very funny. And then Cougar with the folks that have addiction to technology, and some of the things that are happening to them are pretty funny. How do you think about humor in your stories? Is that something you actively think about?
I guess I don't necessarily sit down to write a funny story, but inevitably humor becomes part of the writing process oftentimes. And I think that's because writing about difficult topics like climate change, like patriarchy, like different forms of oppression, is hard. It's depressing. People don't want to think about it. That's why they don't think about it. That's why it's oftentimes not spoken about or avoided. However, if you can approach these subjects from unexpected angles, if you can find points of access, if you can merge both hard things with humorous things or beautiful things, or an unexpected sense of wonder, to me, that's a way to kind of make the challenging subjects, the challenging material visible. And that feels like an important project for me as a writer.
Right. Yeah, I talk to a lot of writers about this, whether they intentionally put humor in their work or not, because I find writer to be an effective subterfuge for difficult topics. And, comedians like Richard Pryor, they used to talk about drug addiction, or writers like Kurt Vonnegut, who would write about World War II, but having humor in his work. I find it to be a very effective way to discuss those things without coming out and saying, "Oh, I'm going to talk about grief or death." You can bring it through humor.
Absolutely. I am actually teaching a climate fiction class this spring at Oberlin College, and the students are reading a lot of really depressing articles about real climate events, and some of them are kind of coming across this material for I think the first time or in seeing it in this grade of detail. And I think as a teacher, one of my roles is to bring some levity to the classroom and find ways to have fun, even as we're engaging with these tough things. And like I said, the same goes for my writing.
Right. So one of the stories I keep coming back to, the one I love the most, I mean, we could talk about all the stories, for hours, because they're all so great. But the one I keep coming back to is Colonel Meriwether's Intergalactic Finishing School for Young Ladies of Grace and Good Nature, which I love that title. It's so long. Although I did love Cougar, I did love Loving Homes for Lost and Broken Men quite a bit. I keep coming back to this one particular story because there's just so many elements in it that I just thought were so great. One is that it's written as a transcript, which is very difficult to get the humanity and humor and those type of things through something that's supposed to be just a transcribed text. And then also it was very striking that the folks that were on this particular ship that are going to look for another planet to inhabit, which, you would imagine that this is humanity in the future, that they have this kind of conservative setup where these young folks are getting ready for a promenade where young ladies, and they refer to them as ladies, are going to be paired up with men. Although it's not mentioned that maybe it's for procreation reasons, but there's other reasons that they seem to be overly concerned about. And then the idea that, is it Carolyn or Caroline, do you feel her name is pronounced in the story?
I pronounce it Caroline.
Caroline, right. So She loves her artificial intelligent roommate, H-Beck, and feels closer to H-Beck than the other humans on the ship. So can you tell me about the nugget of inspiration for this particular story, and then get into why you wanted to tackle it in this particular style of the transcription?
Sure. I think the nugget of inspiration for this story is the obsession with space that I see present in media discussions of, say, Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk and their interest in kind of going into space. So these billionaire men,
right,
heading out there on these ego trips, basically. And also the kind of idea that floats around that if we ruin the planet, we can and should just kind of head out into the galaxy and we'll find a new planet. And there's one out there, and that's kind of the next step for us. And I think these the way that space gets thought about, I find kind of frustrating, because I don't think that there is a planet B for us. And I think that kind of counting on space as a way to save ourselves is not the answer. Kind of bringing it back to this collection as a whole, there's a thread of what I would describe as retrofuturism that runs through this story, but also other stories. And my idea is that by offering up speculative futures that also contain recognizable elements of our past or our history, or of persistent, often conservative paradigms, the collection is striving to show how we're on a crash course to kind of perpetuate old ways of thinking that have brought the catastrophes into being in the first place. And I think that we often think that the future will inevitably be new and different, and that true progress awaits us. But I think, in fact, unless we intentionally change how we do things, we're going to just keep perpetuating cycles of oppression and of and exploitation. So in this story, by having this sort of silly, in many ways, finishing school in space, I wanted to kind of capture another angle of that maybe billionaire impulse to go up into space because you can, and because you think that's your ticket out, and to imagine it from a different character's perspective, but in a way offer commentary or kind of on that reality.
Right. Yeah, I saw them, going out into space as being like this ridiculous extension of manifest destiny, right? It's like, okay, we're just going to keep going and keep exploring, and
exactly,
go, and it's like, rather than just fixing what we have here at home, right? Wasting all these resources on, like you said, launching men into space, which is pretty ridiculous. But there's also this notion in the story about when you mentioned the finishing school, that the young gal's being taught to white lie to the men to kind of help their self-esteem, which I thought, why do that, right? That's so ridiculous. Right? But you're right. There are these moments where we as a society tend to kind of look backwards, and it can be harmful, right? Particularly when you have these people that want to, I don't know, they should be advancing and doing something different.
Yeah, I think we have to intentionally evolve and intentionally undo the many ways that we've been socialized, and kind of reckon with what it would mean to create, I think, generally a just and equitable society. And that means kind of unpacking gender roles. It means unpacking so much. And I think this story, by kind of going in the opposite direction, is trying to speak to that.
Right. One last thing about this story. Why do you feel Caroline is she feels so close to H-Beck? What is it about that relationship to, this artificial being? She says over and over, I wish I could take you with me. I really enjoy coming and talking to you more than anything else. Why do you feel that she's this way?
Caroline's a little bit different than anyone else on the ship because she was mysteriously placed on the ship at the last minute as a baby, and so she's kind of an orphan. And so in some ways the AI roommate is a kind of surrogate parent for her, and is also someone who is willing and able to tell her about Earth and where she came from. And I think human beings innately crave information about who we are, where we came from, why we exist. And if wherever that is coming from is something that we're drawn to. And my hope is that that kind of relationship, that intimacy, grounds the story, even as the story is kind of swirling around maybe bigger abstract topics and making comments about space and neocolonialism. And I think in all my stories, I'm trying to balance both the personal and political in that sense.
We did a fantastic job. So what is something you've learned about the publication process for this particular book that you'd like to share with the writing community? Maybe something that has surprised you or you learned that was different from previous books?
Well, in some ways, I feel that the publishing process is still in motion because the book hasn't come out yet. So there's a sense of the unknown ahead. But one thing I've been thinking about with this book in particular is the process of ordering the short stories. And I don't think we talk that much as writers about what it means to create a sequence of short stories that adds up to a larger narrative, and that both gives a reader a sense of kind of continuity, but also an evolution over the course of a book, and how you pace short stories, how you have stories cohabitate that might have been written years apart. And I'm really grateful that my editor kind of worked with me and was in dialogue with me as we figured out how to do that pacing and how to try to tell a larger story in a way that made sense. And probably in the writing process, for anyone writing a short story, thinking sooner rather than later about that big picture is important.
Right. So I know there's a couple ways to approach a short story collection. So one would be that you kind of collect a bunch of things that have been written over a period of time. Some people call it a cycle if they're writing a lot of short stories. And some people actually sit down and say, okay, I'm going to actually write a collection. I spoke to Fernando Flores a while back, who has an excellent short story book called Valley-esque. And the majority of those stories, he actually sat down for 6 months and wrote them together. So how did you approach this group of stories? Are these scattered out through the past several years, or did you sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write a group of these together?
Kind of a mix of the two.
Okay.
Because on one hand, there are a couple stories in the collection that are from maybe 2014, 2015 era. I was living in Arizona at the time, thinking about intense climate there. And then another story, Loving Homes for Lost and Broken Men, I wrote while I was living in Bulgaria, actually. But probably about at least half of the stories I wrote more or less during the pandemic, actually.
Right.
And so I was very much immersed in catastrophe. I was locked down by myself, and I had just sold my novel. And so I finally felt kind of liberated from that project. And I had all these stories that I had been thinking about for years, but had been trying to not get distracted by. So they really came out pretty fast. And I had a sense by then of the type of book I wanted to write. And so that that helped the book ultimately come into being.
Right. So your last book, your novel Eleutheria, how do you look at a collection of short stories compared to writing a novel? To you, what's to you specifically when you're doing a big project like that? How do you find it different than writing short stories?
So at this point, I've written, I don't know, over 50 short stories and published them. And I've only written one novel.
Oh,
And
okay.
so at this point, I feel much more um, confident when it comes to writing a short story. And I know there's still infinite things I can learn and ways I can grow, and I want to keep getting better at it. But just I think I brought a much greater sense of confidence to writing a short story where I can sit down, I can write out the whole draft by hand, see the whole thing, and then revise obsessively from there. But I know what I've got. Whereas writing that novel, it took me about 5 years. It was my first novel ever. I felt pretty much the whole way that I had no idea what I was doing, that there were skills I needed to learn, such
Right.
as how to write a plot.
You're right. Mm-hmm.
And that was really challenging. And I couldn't write the novel in one sitting. I had to write it in many sittings and rewrite it over and over again, and create tons of material that would get cut. I started outlining, which I hadn't done before.
Right.
And it was messy and chaotic.
Right. Yeah, I've talked to so many writers and they all have a different process, but even the great ones tell me I'm going back and I'm reaching for that book on how to write a novel because it's just one of those things that no matter how many times you do it, it's just like this daunting task.
Absolutely.
Right. So what are you working on right now?
So right now I'm working on a few more stories and essays to try to send into the universe as this new collection comes out. But I'm also turning towards another novel. I'm going to give it another
All
go.
right.
It's going to be multi-genre, involving historical fiction, auto fiction, and speculative fiction,
Oh, okay.
which feels really ambitious. I don't know how I'm going to pull it off, but I'm really excited to kind of maybe think about climate change in a whole nother way, among other things.
Right. Autofiction with historical fiction. That's a crazy mix. So if you were stuck on a desert island, you could only have one book with you. What book would that be?
I don't know if this answer is allowed, but I probably bring my novel in progress so I could get some work done on it.
Okay, that answer is allowed for sure. All right, so this is the time in the show where we do the lightning round. It's not a concept that we created. It's something we stole from inside the Exeter studio, but it's not their concept. They took it from Bernard Pivot. He stole it from Marcel Proust. Allegra Hyde, are you ready for the lightning round?
I'm ready. Let's
All
go.
right, let's do it. What's your favorite word?
Vertiginous.
Okay. What's your least favorite word?
Oh, I hate to say it, but neuter.
All right. What turned you on
Idealism.
and what turned you off?
Dishonesty.
What is your idea of happiness?
Probably going into the cold Atlantic Ocean in the summer and then lying out on the sand.
Oh, that sounds nice. Who's your favorite author?
This is pretty tough. I'm gonna say in this moment, Rachel Kushner.
Okay. Yeah, if you could be a character from any well-known novel, who would that be?
Probably Lucy Pevensey from the Chronicles of Narnia.
Ooh, very nice. I read that book with my daughter not too long ago. That was really fun to revisit. What profession other than your own would you want to attempt?
I think on one hand, maybe a vegetable farmer, but then on the other, maybe a field goal kicker in the NFL.
Oh, yeah, nice. What profession would you least want to do?
Probably prison guard.
Excellent. So if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you reach the check-in desk?
You'll get them next time.
All right, Allegra Hyde, your new novel coming out next month, The Last Catastrophe. Everybody go out and get it. And thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate our conversation.
This has been a presentation of Austin Liddy Limits, made possible with help from our good friends at Blue Ink Review, where typing "the end" is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com.